Hello there! Welcome to Geopolitics Productions. I'm Grace Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be looking at geopolitics in the 21st century. So we're going to be looking at Atlanticism versus Eurasianism. Now I want to give a massive shout out. There's a YouTube channel called Strategy Stuff. Now I highly recommend that you watch their videos because there's lots of different theories with regards to geopolitics that kind of get covered in that. And one of the videos that we're going to focus on in particular is their video on Mackinder's heartland theory. So first of all, we have to kind of step back a little bit and talk about different concepts with regard to geopolitics. So different kind of empires are kind of categorized in two separate ways. So you have a so-called phallisocracy, and then you have a telegraphy, right? If I've mispronounced it, apologies, right? So a phallisocracy is basically a sea power. So this is where it has most of its power based on like sea control and being able to expand its territory via the maritime routes. So in ancient times, an example of this would have been the city-state of Athens, which obviously had many different colonies spread around the Mediterranean. So yeah, that's an example of it in ancient times. In more modern times, an example would have been the British Empire, which obviously had the world's largest empire, and it was spread very kind of geographically diverse places, all around the whole world. And then in more modern times, you'd have the so-called American Empire, right? So if you look at all the US bases that they have around the world, if you look at the level of American influence around the world, this is an example of the so-called American Empire being a phallisocracy, right? So that is what a phallisocracy is. However, a teleocracy is obviously the exact opposite of that. So that's basically a land power. So this is in the ancient world, the example would have been ancient Sparta. In more modern times, you would have had France and Germany, because obviously they had colonies in different places, but most of their focus was on what was happening on the continent of Europe. And then in the present era, the main teleocracies would be Russia and China. So with what Mackinder was saying basically is that the world can be split into two regions, right? So you have the so-called outer islands, right, which is basically the Americas, it's Britain, it's Japan, it's Australia, etc., etc. And these kind of make the kind of outer part of the world. Meanwhile, you have the world island. So this is basically Afro-Eurasia, right? So Africa, continent of Europe, and Asia. Now this bit here, the world island, makes up about 78% of the world's population, right? And about 55% of the total land area. So this is where human activity is, right? This is where the main focus for humanity is. So when you contrast the world island to the so-called outer islands, the outer islands combined only have about 22% of the world's population and only 36% of the world's total area. Because obviously Antarctica isn't counted with this because no one lives there and stuff, right? So this means that human civilization is pretty much focused on what happens in Afro-Eurasia. Then if you want to kind of focus even more so on the so-called world island, right? You split it again into the so-called rimlands and the heartland, right? So the rimlands, this is basically where civilization has, for the most part, taken place, throughout the world, right? So this is, stretching all the way from the Atlantic, going through the Mediterranean, going through the Middle East, India, and along the coast of China, right? So this rimland area represents about 22% of the total area of the world island. However, about 75% of the total population of the world island resides within these rimlands. Now, when you contrast that to the heartland makes up the vast majority of the world island's total area. It makes up about 72% of the total land area of the world island, but it makes up just 25% of the population. And so a famous quote that Mackinder said was this: "Whoever controls Eastern Europe controls the world island. Whoever controls the world island controls the world." Because most of the world's population, most of the resources, etc., are concentrated within the world island. And because of the flat terrain of Eastern Europe, whoever controls that is then essentially able to control what happens in the rest of the heartland, and therefore they're able to control the rest of the world. So that's kind of what we're seeing now with what's going on in Ukraine within this context of these different things. But if we're talking about kind of how to say, Atlanticism, yeah, versus Eurasianism, we have to understand that each civilization has its own way of looking at things, has its own values, and has its own way of thinking about how the world order should be, right? So starting off with the Atlanticists, right? So if you look at England, for instance, yeah, if you look at the geography of England, as I said before, the thing is with England is obviously it's separated from the rest of the continent by the English Channel. And as a result, England has never been invaded in the last 950 years, which means that, you know, for the English, there's never been a big focus on having a large army. It's been more focused on having a strong navy, on having an army which can be deployed in different places all around the world, right? And by not having a large army, it meant that the state didn't need to be as large as it was in other places, right? And therefore, because it's more kind of mercantile, because it's more focused on trade, etc., it means that there's a large mercantile class, and therefore the kind of cosmopolitan and kind of like international world values that they have can be kind of spread around the whole rest of the world. So this means that for the Atlanticists, their view of the world order is essentially one of universal values, yeah, universal human rights, etc., which aren't really universal at all. So if you look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, yeah, talking about all these universal values, these values are not Russian values. These values are not Chinese values. They're not Middle Eastern values. They're not Indian values. They're not African values. They're not Latin American values. They're not even really European values yet, because virtually all the things that we can think of as so-called like universal values pretty much came from England, right? The rule of law, limited government, all these different things here, yeah, things that we think of, yeah, they didn't really exist in most of the places in the continent. You could argue in some places, like in Germany, you can argue Switzerland, you argue a few like Scandinavian countries, etc., to a limited extent, but for the most part, they weren't really there in France. You know, you had absolutism in France, etc. So when we kind of think about this, it's like actually these kind of universal values are pretty much resigned to the Anglosphere and to the kind of like region that the Anglosphere has influence over. So that's a worldview that comes out of Atlanticism. However, if you compare and contrast this to the Eurasianists, right? So if you look at the big Eurasian powers, yeah, say for instance, you look at Russia. Russia is surrounded on all sides by hostile land powers, right? Which at various different times have invaded them and still can invade them to this day. So for the Russians, yeah, they've needed to have a strong state. They needed to have a large army. They needed to have authoritarianism in order to A, keep the population under control, and B, to defend against foreign attackers, right? And you say the same thing with China as well, right? So this doesn't lead itself towards this kind of liberal worldview, right? The mercantile class, because Russia and China are pretty much like hemmed in. So for instance, with Russia, like kind of to its north, it has obviously the Arctic Ocean, which means that for the most part, most of Russia's ports are frozen, like kind of in winter. So they don't have warm water ports except for in the Black Sea. And even in the Black Sea, that gets choked up by the Turks, who obviously have control over the Bosphorus. So that means that Russia is not able to really project its powers into the rest of the world. And the same thing with the Chinese, yeah, the so-called first and second island chains, basically, Japan, Philippines, Taiwan, etc. It's very difficult for them to project their power out into the rest of the world. And therefore, because they haven't been big trading nations, right? And the same thing with like the Indians, same thing with to some extent like with the kind of powers in the Middle East, yeah. They've been very focused in on themselves, and they've not really projected their force into the rest of the world. So this means that each of these kind of civilizations has a completely different worldview. Because then they're not able to spread their values to the rest of the world, they understand that their values are particular to their region, right? And therefore, they don't try and spread them to the rest of the world, right? So the values within the Middle East is, they don't pretend that these are universal values. The values within China or in Russia, etc., they don't pretend that these are universal values. So this leads to a very, very different worldview and stuff. And actually, you can see this in the present day at the moment. If you look at the invasion of Ukraine, the countries which condemned it were the so-called international community. Except that international community, when you actually look at it, is actually pretty much just the West, right? Because the whole rest of the world didn't care, right? They didn't care about Russia invading Ukraine. They don't care about international order. They don't care about like international norms. They don't care about universal values, etc., etc. Because for them, those things are not important, right? This is why you have such a kind of like clash, yeah, between the kind of the Western world and the so-called Eastern world, yeah, between Atlanticism and Eurasianism, because of the kind of geography, because of the kind of history which stemmed from that. That's why their worldview is kind of shaped in the way that it is. Now, you have to ask the question, yeah, is geography a sole determinant, right? Are there ways of overcoming geography? Well, yes, because, so we have to bear in mind, obviously, technology has moved on quite a lot, right? So geographic determinism made a lot of sense in the early stages of human development. However, in the stage that we're at now, we're coming to like overcome many of these kind of barriers, right? So, for instance, if we look at England, right? So the last 500 years, our policy has always been to have a divided Europe. So if the French become too powerful, if the Germans become too powerful, if the Russians become too powerful, whoever it is, right, we have to maintain the so-called balance of power. So this means that whenever there's a stronger country that's coming into power on the continent, we have to team up with the smaller countries and then gang up and basically destroy them, right? That's been our strategy thus far. So logically speaking, if there's this move towards having a United States of Europe, yeah, i.e. like a federal Europe, so the EU basically becoming its own state, similar to the United States, then that would mean that English people, like if they're just looking at it in pure geographic terms, it would be in their national interest to divide up the EU, to basically turn north and south against each other, to turn east and west against each other, etc., etc. Basically, trying to get like the Poles to hate the Germans and the Germans to hate the Italians and blah, blah, blah. So that's one strategy. However, there's also the kind of the so-called democratic peace theory, right? So this is the idea that liberal, developed democracies do not go to war with each other. So if you look at the list of countries which are democracies which have gone to war with each other, very, very tiny. In most of these cases, it's very, very short wars. And also the level of democratic development in these countries was very, very like low at that point. The franchise wasn't extended to most people, or they just had different values and stuff, right? So it wasn't really a liberal democracy, it's just a more kind of authoritarian system. So with that in mind, people in England could then look at the EU and be like, actually, as long as it stays liberal, is there much of a threat, that we're going to be invaded, by this EU, right? The EU is struggling to come up with a consensus for very, very basic things. Even if you could get for perhaps France or Germany or whoever, to decide, right, we're going to invade England, good luck trying to get everyone else within that union to also agree to that, right? And having a European army would necessitate pretty much just a defensive posture, because trying to extend that force outwards, right? There's so many divisions within that army, it's like a Tower of Babel, the whole thing would collapse in itself. So from a national security standpoint, England doesn't necessarily need to be threatened by the calls for a united Europe thing. So geography, yes, it does play a part, but it's not like the sole determinant. Now, when we talk about the Atlanticist states, realistically, there's only 3 countries which count. So you have United States, obviously, right? So again, in terms of geography, the United States has Canada to its north, which has a tenth of the population. You have Mexico to the south, which has a third of the population and is very disorganized. You have Europe, which is 3,000 miles away from it, like across the Atlantic. You have Japan and the rest of East Asia on the other side of the Pacific, which is 5,000 miles away. So the United States is pretty much like England, but just exported out onto a continental level, right? You see the same thing with Canada, you see the same thing with Australia, you see the same thing with New Zealand. Because yes, obviously a lot of the people like who originally kind of came to these places were English, but it's also a thing where the geography of these places also meant that they were far removed from any threat, and therefore these universal values still kind of made sense to them. These liberal kind of democratic values still made sense wherever they were. So these are kind of things to consider. So America is very blessed geographically. It has a very large population. It has a very strong military. And also as well, in terms of the demographics of America, America has a young population, right? It has a birth rate, which is more than a replacement level. So that's why America's population is growing. Now, what you're seeing in most of the places in the rest of like the so-called West, right, is declining birth rates, right? So the only countries which are kind of bucking that trend are places like America, places like France, places like England, right? So Germany, for instance, Germany, you could say it counts, but the thing is, on a demographic basis, right, Germany has a declining population, and its economy, although its economy is large, it is wholly dependent on exporting to other European countries. So the thing is, people often say that the EU is run by Germany, and this is largely true. However, the fact is that Germany needs the EU just as much as the EU needs Germany, because if it didn't have all these countries that it could export its goods to, it would have collapsed a long time ago. So Germany isn't really a great power. Same thing with Japan, its aging population, they've had stagnation for the last 30 years. They are not doing great, so Japan can't kind of be ruled out, right? So that pretty much just leaves America, France, and England as the only countries which actually count, which actually have large enough population, which have strong enough militaries, and which have above level like replacement levels. Although it should be said that in all these places, with the exception of America in certain states, the replacement rate is pretty much only because of migrants, because migrants and their descendants tend to have more children than the kind of native population does. So that's something to kind of bear in mind, that they still are having relatively low birth rates, but still the population of England, population of France, population of America is going to continually grow throughout the 21st century. If you look at our competitors such as China, such as Russia, they are going in the opposite direction, right? They have shrinking populations, and their age demographics are very, very poor, which means that now is kind of the only chance that they have to actually expand their power, right? So as much as it's kind of been focused on in terms of like the threat that they pose, that's something to kind of bear in mind. But the thing is, with the kind of global order that the Atlanticists have kind of like imposed on like the rest of the world, it's allowed, globalization, right? So globalization is basically the overcoming of these geographic barriers, which kind of stop people, right? So by having all this trade, by having all this interconnectivity, by having this relative peace, it meant that certain regions of the world, which on a kind of geographical level could never really hope to expand, now they're able to expand and develop and stuff, right? So for instance, sub-Saharan Africa and most other places in the third world, without this international order, would not be able to actually have grown at the level that they are. However, if we look at this international order now, we can see that throughout the rest of this 21st century, so either by mid-century or by the end of the century, all else being equal, we're going to have in situations whereby things are going to flip very, very rapidly, and it's going to really mess with how we in the West kind of view things. So, for instance, at the moment, Britain has a GDP which is equivalent almost to the entire combined GDP of the whole continent of Africa. Now, that's going to be not the case for very much longer, right? So by mid-century, by the end of the century, you're going to have states like Nigeria, states like Ethiopia, although obviously their standard of living is going to be much lower than different places in the West. It still is going to be a thing where countries like Germany, countries like England, countries like France, etc., are going to have smaller economies than countries like Ethiopia, like Nigeria, etc. So our perception of the world, when we think about the top 20 countries, it's always been like the same kind of, Britain, America, France, blah, 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 etc., etc. That's going to change within this century, right? All else being equal. Now, for various different reasons, these states like Nigeria, like Indonesia, like Ethiopia are unlikely to survive because industrialization tends to lead to nationalism, and obviously these states are largely artificial, kind of like the a legacy of like kind of like colonial empires and stuff. There's no actual nation states in most of these places, so for the most part, these places are probably going to break apart. They're not probably going to exist by the end of the century. But all it's been equal, the point is more that the economic power of Africa, of India, of Latin America, etc., is going to balloon. So the focus of economic development in the world is going to shift further and further away from the West. Now, when we had a unipolar world, as as we all kind of like grew up in, right, it was easy to talk about universal values. But when the economic center of the world becomes so far removed, from the West, when the West isn't able to impose these values on the rest of the world, where's that going to leave the West, right? It was Chairman Mao who said that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Now, when these countries are small and weak and stuff, right, it made sense that you could impose these kind of values. But when these countries end up being on equal footing with you, and in some cases surpassing you, then these universal values are not going to be able to, you can't bully countries, right? You're not going to be able to just bully them into submitting. So that's what we can see now with what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. As much as the West is trying to condemn it and trying to get other countries on side, that time is over. That time when the West could snap their fingers and get the whole world to do something, right, is gone. So that means that the whole world we're moving into now is kind of moving into this kind of multipolar world where there are different civilizations and there are different international norms, right? And there's no kind of universality of it. So that's something which we're going to have to come to terms with, yeah, by the end of this century, yeah, if not much sooner. Realistically, it needs to be much sooner, because that's just not how the world is going to be set up. Now, the thing we have to kind of bear in mind as well, in terms of pushing for these liberal values, etc., is we have to kind of make a choice. Do you want Russia and China to exist, or do you want them to have liberal values? Because the two things cannot happen. If Russia becomes liberal, it will disintegrate. It will go into chaos. It will splinter into a million different pieces. Same thing with China. Whenever centralized control in Russia or in China have ever broken down, that is when just, everything has just fallen to pieces. So these states cannot survive having liberal values. So if the aim is to destroy Russia, is to destroy China, whether that is the right case or not, right? The point is that the best way to do it would be to impose these liberal values onto them. And so if we want Russia and China to still exist as states by the end of the century, it has to be with recognition that we can't, like in the same way that the West would not be the West, yeah, if we adopted the authoritarianism of Russia and China, right? So we have to kind of understand that each region has its own cultural values, and over time we're going to have to learn to respect that, because if we try to impose our values like how we did in Iraq, like how we did in Afghanistan, etc., you can't spread freedom and democracy and liberalism, etc., at the barrel of a gun. It just doesn't work at this point. And also as well, something to note is that talking about like nuclear weapons and stuff, right? So obviously the Russians and the Chinese, right, obviously have nukes. And the thing is to note is that our military in the Atlanticist countries, right, are much, much stronger than that of the Eurasian ones. So yes, the Eurasian ones have larger militaries, but they're not actually that experienced. So the example I'll give is twofold, yeah. First of all, Vietnam, and second of all, Afghanistan. So the Americans were able to have a war, was it 8,000 miles away, 12,000 miles away, whatever it was, right, in Vietnam. And the American military won every campaign, yeah, that it fought within Vietnam. It only lost because of political will back home. However, the Chinese invaded Vietnam in 1979, and they didn't lose because of public opinion back home, because there's no public opinion that counts in China, right? They lost because their military was so crap that they end up losing to that, right? So for them, they're not experienced in being able to fight different wars and stuff, right? And the same thing you can be saying with the Russians. Obviously, you can see what's happening now with Ukraine, but even if you look at Afghanistan in the 1980s, right? We left Afghanistan because we kind of got bored of being there still, right? The Soviets end up having to leave Afghanistan in the late 80s because they were resoundingly defeated by the Mujahideen. So we're able to fight on multiple different continents at the same time, multiple different threats, and win on a strategic level. Russia and China are not able to do that. And so it's very clear, and this recent conflict in Ukraine has shown this, that if there were only conventional weapons which were at hand, Russia and China would have been defeated by the West long, long ago. So that means that the nuclear umbrella is the only thing that's keeping these societies afloat. And if we were to move towards having more anti-ballistic missiles, then that just completely negates everything, right? So for instance, Israel has the Iron Dome system, which shoots down 90% of rockets. Obviously, the rockets which Hamas and stuff are firing are nothing like nuclear weapons. But if you were to have like a better kind of like anti-ballistic missile systems, right, which probably with increased technology over the rest of this century will probably get to, that puts Russia and China in very precarious state. So they've got declining populations, aging populations, and nuclear weapons becoming more and more irrelevant, that puts them in a great like peril, basically, yeah, right? And whether those states survive to the end of the century is very much up in question, right? So there's two things that the West cannot allow, right? One is a united Eurasia. The second is a Eurasia with access to the sea, right? So in other words, so first of all, we're going to go through the first point, right? What's happening at the moment in Ukraine with these sanctions against Russia is going the complete opposite route that we ought to be taking, because now we're pushing the Russians closer towards the Chinese. We can take on Russia, we can take on China, we cannot take on Russia and China simultaneously, as I've said in previous videos. Definitely check them out. But that's the first thing which we need to do. We have to recognize that, you know, we can't have a united Eurasia. And then the second thing, in terms of basically ensuring that telegraphy never becomes a phallisocracy, right? So first of all, what we have to do with China is make sure that it's contained, make sure it doesn't take places like Taiwan, make sure it isn't able to basically control the South China Sea, it can't control the Indian Ocean, it can't control the Pacific. Because if it's able to do that, then its power will then be projected to the whole rest of the world, and then we have big problems. And the same thing with the Russians. The Russians aren't able to project into most of the different world oceans. However, the Arctic, because of global warming, right, and also just better technology, the Arctic sea lanes are now opening up, which means that Russia and China are way ahead of the West. This is where most sea travel is going to be in this coming century, right? So if you have the choice between sailing a ship from like Europe, right? Do you want to go through the Suez Canal and then go for all the kind of like hazardous routes all there just to get to Asia? Or do you want to go up and over the top of the world, right? And, you know, you cut shipping time significantly by doing that. So the future of, like, you know, well, at least for the rest of this century, is going to be shipping up and over the top of the world, yeah, to get to those East Asian markets. So when Russia is becoming more and more powerful, because it's going to have more and more like sea lanes, right? It's going to have more and more seaports. It's going to have more and more access to the different oil and gas fields that it has up there. And Russia is going to become very, very powerful, yeah, like kind of like based on the kind of like freeing up of its north. So these are things we have to kind of bear in mind for the rest of this century to kind of balance out, right? Now, from the Russian perspective, they also have their own strategy, right? And this is best laid out by Alexander Dugin, right? So this was in 1997. You know, so this is the book, The Foundations of Geopolitics. Now, what he lays out here is a bunch of different goals. So first of all is that they want Franco-German access. So basically, this is the EU. So basically, they want to just give them a free hand in Europe, but they also understand that that France and Germany tend to be quite like anti-American and stuff. So they're like, right, okay, that's good. Like, you know, split the alliance off there and just leave France and Germany to run Europe by themselves. Then when they talk about Britain, they want them to be split off from the rest of Europe, because the way that the Russians see Britain is pretty much, they just see it as America's little lapdog and stuff. They don't really care what England has to say at all. So for them, it's just kind of like, okay, whatever, just keep them separated from the Europeans, and that's fine. Then if you talk about like Russia's near abroad, i.e. the post-Soviet states, so places like Ukraine, etc., etc., Russia, from his perspective, needs to have dominance over these, right? So this is what you can see now with what Putin is obviously doing. He's re-establishing control over Russia's near abroad. And then we've got to China. Dugin says that China is a potential threat to Russia, in particular in Russia's Far East, as we've said in previous videos, and also in Central Asia. So what he says that Russia should encourage China to do more is to focus more on Southeast Asia, right? And to have a kind of like southward push, because if they have a westward push or if they have a northward push, that's going to interfere with Russian interests, right? And then the focus is for the United States. Now, obviously, America can't be invaded, it can't be defeated militarily, etc., etc. But what the Russians do want, and this is what they've wanted since Soviet times, as we've said in previous videos as well, what the KGB did quite a lot, and you can see this especially with Yuri Bezmenov, So he was a former KGB agent, and he exposed in the 1980s what the KGB like, kind of like how they actually operate and stuff, right? So what the Russians do, what the Chinese are now doing, is stoking divisions within America. So first of all, on the kind of political right, so you've got, you know, isolationism, and you've got ethnic nationalism, yeah, like kind of, you know, white supremacists, etc., etc. So they stoke the flames for that, right? And you get people like Donald Trump. And then on the left, they push for you know, the other side of this kind of like ethno-nationalism, right? So they, you know, so back in the day, the KGB supported groups like the Black Panthers, etc. But in more modern era, like, you know, Black Lives Matter, which is actually a Marxist organization, you know, like the actual setup of it is actually a Marxist, and they push for stuff like that, right? So as Alexander Dugin calls it, he calls them Afro-American racists, right? So that's his label for that. So what basically Russia is doing, what China is doing, etc., is stoking the divisions within the West. Because the West obviously is a very open society. So if you look at TikTok, you look at you know, social media, if you look at all these different things, the Russians and Chinese are able to exploit those things by having us debate how many genders there are, you know, having us debate about slavery, you know, and have, you know, so we're having all these debates here, we're taking our eye off the ball, we're becoming more isolationist, right? And as a result, the whole rest of the world is kind of falling apart. And we're too divided to be able to actually rally round and actually focus on what needs to be focused on. And in order to have long-term strategic planning, that's what you need to have, right? You need to have politicians which look past the next election cycle and look generations down the line, right? So what politician comes out and ever talks about what the world's going to look like by mid-century even, let alone by the end of the century? They never do, because they're so focused on winning the next election and talking to their power base, yeah, which is itself divided and stoked up by radicals, right? And of course, these radicals are, like we said, stoked up by the Russians and the Chinese. So that means that our politics becomes more and more fragmented, and this international order, which we profess to love so much, is actually falling to pieces. So all these things are very, very complicated. And now I understand why my university lecturer said not to do this as a dissertation. So originally this was going to be my dissertation. In the end, I just did a dissertation on land value tax, which is, I promise you, much more interesting than it actually sounds. But yeah, I can kind of understand why, yeah, because a dissertation has to be very specific, and this obviously very, very complicated. So if there's any things which you have any questions about, because obviously it's kind of covering a lot of things, and if you don't know a lot about what I'm talking about, some of it might seem a bit kind of, you know, confusing. So if you have any questions regarding any of this thing, and there's any kind of things that you want pointers towards in order to read up on more things, etc., etc., let me know. And if you have any disagreements with kind of like any things that I've said, please let me know. I love hearing disagreements. And the next video, hopefully, should be the one on what if the Stuarts never ruled England. So that's been a long time coming. And then soon we're going to be moving on to film reviews. So yeah, so unless I can think of any other like ideas, it's coming towards the end of the kind of historical and political side of this channel. So thank you to everyone who's kind of stayed with me throughout all this time. I just want to give a big shout out to all the subscribers. And if you haven't subscribed already, what are you doing? Come on now, subscribe. It will help me out, it will help you out, etc., etc. Hit the like button, and yeah, in the meantime, have a great day, and bye.